was that? Yeah. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammad wa barik wa sallim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. So, Shaykh Amin is continuing his tafsir on Sūrah al-Mujādilah. And as we spoke last week, that every surah has a theme that it kind of revolves around. And we spoke about the theme of this surah being transparent. Right? So last week we had the discussion of najwa, of these secret councils. Okay. And the week before that, we had the idea of the Sahabiyya radiallahu anha coming to the Prophet ﷺ and confiding something, and then that becoming apparent. Right? So whatever is hidden, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes that apparent. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this surah, He advises us to be transparent. And we see that same concept continuing today, where the beginning ayah that we saw, أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الَّذِينَ تَوَلَّوْا قَوْمًا غَضِبَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ مَا هُمْ مِنْكُمْ وَلَا مِنْهُمْ. That there is a group of people that have taken as allies those people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dislikes and Allah's anger is upon them. And then the ayah says, مَا هُمْ مِنْكُمْ وَلَا مِنْهُمْ. They're not here and they're not there. They're not part of you and they're not a part of them. So when they come to the Muslims, they say one thing, and then when they go to the disbelievers, they say another. So it's this lack of transparency. It's what we call being two-faced. Right? So what's internal, what's inside these people is not what they express. Right? So it's that lack of transparency that we see that theme continuing throughout the surah. And then Shaykh Amin, mashallah, he expanded, that we can take this at a national and global level about how a Muslim country, in terms of in a political sense, should not ally itself with those that disbelieve in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he did a wonderful job covering that. And then he kind of went to the individual level. And that's kind of where I wanted to expand and reflect on what he said. That, subhanAllah, one of the first things that I want to say is that the tafsir that we heard today and the forthrightness that Shaykh Amin, he spoke with today, and the clarity with which he spoke about today, he wasn't mincing his words, he wasn't beating around the bush. Right? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve our scholars that continue to speak the haqq as it should be spoken. Right? That these type of talks, very rarely do you hear that are public now. Right? So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve him for his khidmah to the deen. Right? At an individual level, what do we do? Right? How does that translate to us in being transparent? And what I understood from what Shaykh Amin was saying is that at an individual level, we cannot at the same time, critique what's happening and criticize what's happening, but then continue to hold on to the same ideals and values that the oppressor is, promoting. Okay, what do I mean by that? Shaykh Amin recently wrote a op-ed for Al Jazeera English, right? And I highly encourage everyone to read that op-ed. Right? And in that op-ed, he speaks about how as Muslims, we need to stop viewing what is happening in Gaza from the perspective of colonialism. Right? So we want to decolonize, but we're still thinking with the paradigm of colonialism. Right? So that's what I understood from him and what he was saying today is that we also have to be transparent in our own beliefs and our own values that we hold on to. Okay. And as an ummah, there are bubbles and there are pockets where, yes, Muslims believe, in the full scope of the ideals that Islam came with. But when we look at the great majority of the individuals that make up the ummah, and you take the ideals and the values that they hold, and you take a yardstick to measure it against the ideals of Islam and the values of Islam, you see a discrepancy there, right? Where, like Sheikh Amin was mentioning in this op-ed, everyone is outraged by what's happening in Gaza. But how do people think about it? Right? That when we think about it, we're still thinking about it as a nation state. Right? We're still thinking about this resistance in the form of, in the same way that everyone else is thinking about it. Right? Where Muslims have our own paradigm of how we think. Right? Where we draw alliances not based on borders that were drawn up on a map by some third party. Right? This nor do we think about, in terms of ethnicity or tribalism or language or culture. Right? I think perhaps it was a month back, or perhaps it was more, one of the faculty of Dar Qasim, Ustad Firas al-Khatib, he had a very nice lecture that was delivered, and I believe it should still be on the Darul Qasim website, where he spoke about the idea of understanding these issues from an Islamic lens and not a colonialist lens, because our resistance and struggle against colonialism is still being shaped and still being viewed through the lens of colonizing. And what I mean by that is, instead of viewing this as a Muslim issue, we're thinking about this as a humanitarian issue. We're thinking of this as a freedom issue. We're thinking about this as a state issue, right? But that's not how Muslims understood it. Right? So for example, in Ustad Firas's lecture, he spoke about how it was defined by scholarship. That we would define areas and we would define our nisbah, our connection to a place, based not on the ethnicity, but perhaps based on the scholarship. And grander and above that, right, the grand scheme is that, when you had the Khilafah in place, right, there was no idea of, okay, this is the place of the Arabs, this is the place of the Kurds, or this is the place of the Turks. No, there's just like Sheikh Amin mentioned, al-kufru millatun wahida, that all of disbelief is one milieu, then all of Muslims and all of Islam was one milieu. So that was an important message that I took today. And I often ask myself that, as an individual, right, how can I impact what's happening? Right? And sometimes you really do feel helpless. What can I do? So recently, I also came to the same conclusion that what I can perhaps do is, starting with myself, take an honest assessment that how do I view these, challenges? How do I view the things that are happening around me? Are they in line with Islamic thought? And then secondly, how can I influence those that are in my sphere of influence to think the same way? Because as Sheikh Amin was saying, that the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they removed every other form of alliance and they replaced it with the alliance of Iman. Okay? And one thing that I've seen that's often a challenge for Muslims, specifically living in the West, and perhaps even more so young Muslims, is that because we see non-Muslims around us so much that we have lost the ghaira, or the honor, and the honor of Iman, right? And what I mean by honor of Iman is that it dictates where your loyalty lies, right? If you look at the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, as he was saying, that like they had to go against their family, right? So that only happens when you think of it as something real, right? When you think of the shahada that I have stated, this is something that's very real, it has a very real impact, right? And I have to define my emotional relationships based on Iman, right? Which is extremely difficult, even as a person, not just in terms of family, but your coworker, your roommate, perhaps, right? That might not be a Muslim, right? And you see that person as well. This is a good person, right? And that's often very challenging for us, because we don't recognize, or we don't feel that a person that doesn't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is an enormous affront to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That this is a crime, right? So we don't think of it in those terms, right? So, and we find it very difficult emotionally to accept that, oh, this is something that's wrong, right? So we need to base our emotional understanding and our emotional commitments based on Islam. And that's really what the last ayah kind of ended with. Inshallah, I'll open it up for questions and discussion now, inshallah. Before we had some questions you had mentioned.
Well, it was really towards the end of the lecture, actually the dua that Sheikh Amin was asking, that make dua in Ramadan that all the Muslims go to Jannah without hisab. And then of course that what makes it easy for the people in Rohingya and Lusa and all that. My question was, in the hadith that talks about their judgment, there's only a select group of people who will go without hisab. Is there a purpose, or what's the reason behind asking for something that actually won't happen? Or asking for suffering to go away when this is the dunya of suffering? Trying to understand that. I know that's not the main purpose of the khutbah, but it was the dua that he ended with, and say hi to everybody.
Yeah, subhanAllah. Right. So I think two things, right? Well, there's always the idea of having hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So this is when it comes to the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one is our aqeedah, right? That this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us is going to happen, right? But another is our adab with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is our suluk with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That how do we behave with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And part of our adab is that we never make any statement that is suggestive of restricting the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Just like, even though, for example, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates things, right, based on human choices that humans would characterize as evil, right? Yeah. So for example, you go to Sūrah al-Kahf, right, where you have the killing of a child, right? Okay. Now a human, such as Musa alayhi salam, is looking at this and says, this is not good, right? Okay. And when Khadr, he explains in the end, he says, he doesn't attribute that action to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? He attributes it to himself. Okay. Now, wasn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the one who commanded him to do that? He did, right? But there's an adab there. The adab is la yunsabu sharru ila Allah, right? That evil is never attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Even though as part of our aqeedah we know that it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that ultimately is the one who creates it. Right? Allah creates what humans choose. Right? And sometimes human actions are evil, but we don't attribute the evil to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So in the same way, we always demonstrate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we have complete hope in comprehensive mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And that answers really both questions, because we know that there's going to be suffering, right? But we always hope from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He will uplift the suffering. And at least in terms of dua, if we don't see our dua being answered here, right, then we know that there is a reward that is reserved for it in the next life. Right? So dua is a win-win situation. Do you have any reflections from today?
Yeah, I think I was the role of success and leadership. I think from today, from the surah and the lecture was not a perspective I had considered when looking at reading the translations with Mujādilah.
Could you expand on that, inshallah?
Yeah. Whenever you're like a leader, you usually has a vision in mind, right? And you're not something you'd be very, very holding on to it. And Muslims, we have a vision of after death. And so if it's like watching a movie. If somebody, a tall person sitting in front of you, you always see this tall person until the movie starts, and then you don't see that person anymore. You see the movie in the cinema. And then it's kind of like when you're trying to get something accomplished. Like for us Muslims, Jannah or after death is that movie, and then the obstacles kind of you don't see them anymore. But that's in whatever you do in life too. If you're going to college, if you're building a career, a business, or whatever. So I think that similarly, I think the portion of where the people who will be two-faced. I'm not, like, what stood out to me was that that's not outside the community, that's within the community. And so it's almost preparing people for that vision that you're just going to have people who are going to say one thing but mean a different thing. And so those are like, do what you think, just know what your vision is or the truth is. And the Quran in a way is preparing you for some, I guess maybe disappointments or some sort of things like, hey, listen, like, why do people say one thing and do another thing? Which is very common. That hurts a lot of people. Yeah. And where it's just saying, listen, that's just, I mean, I know that. Like Allah says, like, I know that exists and it's there for a purpose. Yeah. Just accept it and kind of move on. Yeah. I'll deal with that.
Yeah, subhanAllah.
So I think that was where I was coming.
Yeah. I think Shaykh Hamid spoke about that towards the very end of the tafsir, right? وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. They are the successful ones. Right? That the way he defined success was that for the Sahaba, radiallahu anhum ajma'in, success was dying upon the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because for them, the resistance was not for the purpose of the resistance. Right? The resistance was a means to, was a means to the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And subhanAllah, actually today, I don't know why, but it just randomly came in my mind while I was driving actually today to Dar Qasim here. The famous, resistance, fighter, Mujahid, Umar Mukhtar. Right?
From Libya.
Yeah, from Libya, yeah. And I was just thinking, it's like, subhanAllah, there are so many in our history. Yeah, there's probably so many people that did what they did for the sake of Allah, and they're gone in the pages of history. Perhaps the pages of history don't even have them. Right? There's story after stories of selflessness and sacrifice. Right? And if you look at it from a perspective of dunya, right, what did it amount to? Right? you would, if you're looking at it from a perspective of dunya, from a materialistic perspective, they didn't quote unquote achieve their goal, right? Umar Mukhtar, rahimahullah, he didn't live to see what he wanted, right? It happened after, right? He never saw that, you know. And, you know, when you think about that, it's kind of eye-opening, the amount of ikhlas and amount of sincerity that is required for that. Okay? That I'm doing what I'm doing because this is what Allah wants me to do. And whether I see results from it or not, I will continue to do it. And my goal is to just die upon doing what I'm doing. Right? Because I'm not doing it for anyone else. I'm not doing it to show anyone else. I'm not doing it for the result. If the result comes, then that's a glad tiding from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's a victory from Allah. But my goal is, you know, to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's one more thing that I remembered is that, you know, we have, Sheikh Amin spoke about the global level of, you know, not having these political allies as disbelievers. And then we spoke a little bit about at the individual level what we could do. And there's also over here living in the West, right? There's also something at a communal level that Sheikh Amin spoke about, is that we kind of often have a chip on our shoulder, and we're very apologetic, right? So as organizations, as Muslim organizations, or even just as a larger Muslim community, we kind of always feel like we have to compromise on our ideals. Right? And that, in a sense, is also being two-faced, and that's not being transparent. Right? There's no reason for us to hide our ideals or for us to be ashamed to present our ideals exactly as they are, right? Without having to, quote unquote, as Sheikh Amin kept saying today, being diplomatic, right? You don't have to be diplomatic about our ideals, right? We shouldn't, well, if we say it like this, even, I even see this today in like Muslim organizations, we're going to lose people. We're going to lose the crowd if we do it this way, right? Or if we say this. Right? That's something that I've seen from Sheikh Amin all the time. He says, he's told me so many times in separate occasions, he's like, this is Dar Qasim. He has that, the way he speaks, mashallah. This is Dar Qasim. Dar Qasim does things Dar Qasim's way. Right? So it's that idea of being confident and not worrying about what other people are saying. Right? So that's something else that I took, that, the Quran is guidance for us, right? In every sense, and how we run as an organization, how we function as individuals in a society, and of course at the global level as well. Yeah, mashallah, online people don't have questions, mashallah. It seems like it. Yeah. If you have something you can share, inshallah, we have 2 minutes.
Yeah. It's I think you're talking about with normal thought, right? I mean, like over here, Malcolm X was a huge influence, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, he was very vocal and not compromising on principles.
Yeah.
Even as a Nation of Islam person, and that was a little bit off
too
center,
much, yeah.
But unapologetic to then becoming not apologetic, like being very forthright on Islam after he went for Hajj, to the extent that maybe that is his very own killed him. Like God knows. But my point is, I think so many people, his mission, I think the question is, well, what was the purpose of his life? But so many people, at least I have come to see, like became Muslim because it said, I read Malcolm X.
SubhanAllah. Yeah.
Right. And so sometimes you do what you do, it seems like, but the result isn't what you think it's going to be.
Yeah.
It's almost like when Ibrahim alayhi salam was given the adhan after making that Kaaba, come for Salah.
Yeah.
There's nobody there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But thousands of years later, I think the world, from all over the world, everybody's going there responding to that.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the strength of Muslims. We don't do it so we see it in our life. We do it like that belief of if the Yom of Qiyamah is coming and you're still planting that olive tree, which takes hundreds of years, like it's very, very long-term investment, very long-term investment, you still plant
it,
for the long term.
Yeah.
Because Allah rewards you on your intention.
Yeah.
Even if you don't get to see it.
Yeah.
Because the reward you still get, because the best accountability of tracking all their reward is with Him alone.
Yeah, and I think that's what Sheikh Amin was saying today, is that, we feel hopeless, but that's because we're looking at it from a materialistic worldview. But if you come at it with the spiritual worldview, that Iman is an action, right? Believing Allah has an impact, right? So we often associate impact and effect with all the other avenues that are available to us. But we often don't think that, my thinking of this as evil in my heart actually has an impact on it. Right? So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to act and understand. آخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.